This is for chapter 3. Today we'll be talking about biblical foundations and historical development of ministry in the church. As I said at the beginning of class, this is a crucial chapter because actually on this biblical foundations and on the historical development are we able to construct something that applies to us, but at the same time being rooted in the experience of Jesus himself. So biblical foundations are always crucial. Whether you talk about Christology, we talk about Trinity, you talk about other things, it's always the biblical foundations that are important to bear in mind and to be very clear about. Okay, because sometimes there are authors who use the Bible and use them maybe sometimes out of context to prove a particular point, for example, that they are pursuing. They would use some texts. It's for us to examine whether that process or that way of doing or dealing with the scriptures is something that is valid or legitimate or something that is questionable, something that we can even what do you call this discredit. All right, we will also be talking about the historical development of ministry in the church. To situate ourselves in this chapter, I think it is good for us to start talking about where we are at in terms of okay, in terms of ministries. We are the very common and familiar way of looking at ministries today, of course, is to distinguish between ordained ministries and non-ordained ministries. Ordained, of course, referring to the clerics, the pope, the bishops, the priests, and deacons. Some people consider the deacons as not part of the clerical order, but in any case, a deacon is usually ordained a deacon. So that is one part of or one group of those people who undertake ministry. The other group would be the non-ordained. After the Second Vatican Council, we more and more speak about lay people are having also some form of ministry. You need to remember that before the Second Vatican Council, ministries was something that was considered as the prerogative of the ordained people. And the lay people were only participating in the ministry because they have been deputed or delegated by the ordained ministers. Without that delegation and deputation, then the lay people would not be able to perform or to do ministry. That was before the Second Vatican Council. After the Second Vatican Council, with a wider ecclesiological perspective, we are able now to consider what the lay people are doing in terms of ministry as legitimate ministries in the church. Okay. Now, this present-day understanding or the usual traditional or standard way of presenting ministry in terms of ordained and non-ordained is something, of course, that has roots in an ecclesiological framework, and that is on the hierarchical institutional framework. Again, I was mentioning that the difference between the ordained and the non-ordained is that the non-ordained are delegated by the ordained to do ministry. But there is something more than that. There is a kind of an ecclesiological framework, which is what we call the hierarchical institutional framework, which was adopted actually in the Middle Ages and then, of course, in the Council of Trent. But it's not something that can be said to have been almost literally lifted up out of the New Testament texts. There is some form of hierarchy, some form of institution in the New Testament, but it is something that is rather very general and not even very well defined, as we will find out throughout this morning when we start discussing the ministry and the ecclesiological framework of in the New Testament. You will remember that there used to be the expression, the teaching church and the learning church, ecclesia docens and ecclesia discens. Ecclesia docens, the teaching church, normally refers to the ordained. They are the teaching church, and the lay people are the listening or learning church. So it's more like a passive role that they are playing in the church. The active role is being played by the ordained people. Now, those of you who have taken or are taking now ecclesiology, you would have a more precise discussion on the hierarchical institutional ecclesiology, as well as other ecclesiologies that have already existed in the church. Whereas some of you, those of you, especially the first year, I am sure you probably are familiar with this ecclesiological framework. It's basically from the top, from top down. In other words, at the very top of the triangle is the Pope, followed by the bishops, and then the priests, and then of course the bottom part would be the lay people. So majority of the people in the church are in the bottom part. They are the lay people, and there's only one pope. At least as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, there's only one pope. There could be other popes, but from different sects. But then we have the bishop as a kind of a. Now, this kind of an arrangement is basically hierarchical, but also a feudalistic kind of an arrangement. As you well know, many of the ecclesiologies that the church adopts in the institution itself of the church are taken from the social structures and organizations that existed at that time. So the hierarchical institutional framework, of course, is a very feudalistic kind of organization where you speak about the king, and then, of course, under the king, there are lords, the nobilities, and under the nobilities, you have the lower rank people, and then finally, of course, you have the slaves, the ones who serve the king, the vassals, the lords, and of course the ordinary people. So this is pretty much the sociological or societal structure that was in vogue during the Middle Ages, which until now the church has pretty much kept. And that is why some people said that the church is basically a monarchical organization with one person who is the king, who has the final say on most everything. Okay, now questions. Of course, it's good to start a chapter with the questions so that we know exactly where we're going. Have the church ministries always been this way? So when you come up with the distinction between ordained and non-ordained, based on the hierarchical institutional framework of the church, has it always been this way? And then another question is, what is the basis of such an arrangement in the Bible? What is the basis of such an arrangement in the Bible, especially during the time of Jesus or in Jesus' experience? In other words, if it is something that has gone on for so long, is there any way we can go back to the Bible and see the roots of this particular arrangement? If it developed in time, what was the historical context when such an idea of ministry was adopted? I made mention to you about the Middle Ages, but we will discuss this a little bit more and in greater detail when we come to the later part, almost like the chapter 4. What ecclesiological framework underpins such a perspective on ministry? And then, of course, how was such a structure justified theologically? How was it understood from the perspective of faith? These are important items that we need to discuss in this chapter. And the answers, of course, is that The hierarchical institutional structure of ministry developed in the course of history. In other words, it's something that, yes, we find in history, and some find justification for it in the New Testament. We speak about the College of Bishops as the College of Apostles. It has some New Testament roots, but we will discuss today exactly what are those roots or what do they imply. This is, however, not the only organizational model of church ministry. There are others. There were others, and there are others even up to now. Ministerial models had their respective and different historical contexts. The reason there are different ministerial models is because the context have changed from one generation to the next, and from era or one period to the next. And this is also true for us, and it will be true as well in the future. Now, they are justified on the basis of a particular theological perspective. You know, when you have a kind of an organization or a church structure in this way or that way, theologians are very bright in coming up with justification for it, in drawing from tradition as well as the scriptures, and then we're able to say that this is a legitimate development of church structure in the church. That is what I mean by justifying. This is not something like I'm justifying it because even if it's not true, I'm trying to create a kind of uh, the arguments for its validity. All I'm trying to say when I say justified is how is it seen from a theological perspective. Okay? There is a need then to review the different ministry models, locate the biblical roots, examine their historical contexts, understand their theological justification. And then, of course, in the end, how can we assess whether this particular model is still applicable in our own times? Okay, so there is a way of looking at the history, but at the same time, its relevance to our own times. So this chapter will examine the biblical foundations and the historical development through the centuries. In this particular section on the historical development, we talk about the context, the historical cultural context, the kinds of ministries, what is being done, what type of ministry, who are doing those ministries, and of course the theological understanding or the theological justification. And towards the end of the chapter, we will assess its relevance today, a kind of evaluation of what it means to us at this particular point in time. Now, there are different ways of presenting historical development. And that's, if you have already read the articles that I have given you, there are different ways, and maybe you can get confused. But by and large, they are really talking about the same things. There might be some slight, what it calls nuanced kind of difference or divergence between these authors, but in general, they're basically along the same track, especially when you talk about the general lines of development. Specific lines of development, some authors will be a little bit more working in detail, but for example, the works of O'Meara and Power, he spoke in general about New Testament, the first millennium and the second millennium. It's a simple kind of arrangement that you're able to tackle these things easily. But there is also another way of presenting it. Like in Gonzalez Faust, and I don't know whether you have realized it, but Gonzalez Faust discusses very, very well New Testament data about ministry. Very, very clear about ministry. And in great detail. We're talking only about the New Testament. Of course, there are different books in the New Testament and different ways of looking at ministry in the New Testament. But from there, he jumps into what we would call the clericalization of ministry. In other words, the departure from the basic communitarian-based ministry to something that is more hierarchical, institutional, which means, of course, greater role being played by the leaders of the church, by the ordained ministers, especially by the bishops, and of course, the priests. There's also a lay-oriented historical presentation. I did not give you the author to read, but Paul Lakeland, for example, is one ecclesiologist who has written a great deal about the role of the laity. And Osborne also has written about lay ministry. He's got a very thick book on lay ministry. But he talks about New Testament data also, but always from the perspective of how it impacts the laity through the centuries. Where were the laity placed? I mean, what is the effect of, let's say, the clericalization of ministry? What was the effect of this on the lay people? This would be the perspective of someone like Paul Lakeland, who talks about ministry from the lay perspective. We are following basically Bernier, but Bernier is a very detailed discussion because he has got a whole book. So when you have a whole book, you can talk about all of these things. Starts with the New Testament, the ministry as charism, Merky, reformation of ministry as cult, and then reappraisal of ministry before the Second Vatican Council, of course, Vatican II idea of ministry. Now, you can already see from the chapter divisions that Bernier had made, you can already see that he's going to characterize a particular age or a particular epoch in church history as developing this type of ministry, or at least this type of ministry is the dominant type of ministry at this particular age. So, for example, from the year 70 to 110, the idea of ministry as charism was very strong. There was, of course, other things there, like leadership of the apostles or leadership of the disciples of Jesus. That's still there, but the prevailing aspect of ministry at this particular time is more as charism. And then the shift from this charismatic kind of ministry to the important role that the bishop would play in regard to the ministry. That comes several years later, or maybe a generation or two later. And then the shift, not only from the bishop, but also towards the priests. Priesthood now is considered as a minister. So what this basically implies is that, are we saying that priesthood was not present in the New Testament? Well, of course, some kind of priesthood was present in the New Testament, but the priesthood here we'll be talking about would be priesthood in terms of ministry, or the role of the priest in terms of ministry. And what happened, of course, is that they have now become identified as the church minister. At least the most basic church minister would be the priests. Then you go up the ladder, you go to the bishops, and of course go to the pope. But if you would like to look at a priest or a minister in the church, the nearest person you can refer to would be the priest. But there came a time also when monastery or monks were considered as ministers. In what sense were they ministers? We will take that up later. And then ministry as hierarchy. This is now in the Middle Ages, from 1055 to 1414. This is what we would call the golden age of scholasticism, and that is basically a perspective of Thomas Aquinas and company. And then shortly after, of course, not shortly after, but several hundreds of years later, Martin Luther and company would have a different view of ministry. This is taken up. And then in response to the Protestants, the Council of Trent would speak about ministry from a more cultic perspective. And I guess that is really what has come down to us even until now. And shortly before the Second Vatican Council, there was a reappraisal of what ministry is all about, incorporating basically fresh researches on in the New Testament, especially in the idea of ministry in the apostolic period. Then, of course, Vatican II talking about ministries, not only of the lay people, but also of the priests and the bishops. Okay. All right. So our way, I am sort of adapting kind of a mixed model, but still relying for the most part on Bernier's division, because I think this is probably the best way for us to appreciate the different stages of growth and development that took place in the church in regard to the question of ministry. So, for example, we will be talking about New Testament data, and then the first millennium. We will be talking all these things that Bernier would speak about in the first millennium. In some authors, the division between the first and the second millennium was clear cut. In Bernier, actually, it's not as clear cut. Difficult to except for, of course, the dates. But beyond that, in terms of movement, in terms of development, that is not as easily this is clear cut. Second millennium, again, talking about the Middle Ages, we talk about the Reformation and the Council of Trent, and of course, Vatican II. Okay. So in this section, we will be talking about the sociocultural historical context first, and then the types of ministry or the ministers, ecclesiological and community perspective, in other words, the ecclesiology that underpins this particular idea of ministry, and then how do they explain this understanding of ministry? In other words, theological underpinnings of this concept of ministry. Okay. So as we go through this, again, we ask the question, what is the local situation, context? What are the ministries in terms of leadership, in terms of pastoral care, and who is doing this type of ministry? What is the ecclesiological perspective? And then how is ministry understood theologically? So questions to bear in mind. Do you know where this church is? Does anybody know? Does anybody can guess where this church is? Where do you think? Where in Cebu?
Yung may malaking shark.
That's Oslob.
Oslob. I don't know,
So
but it's not sure.
South of Cebu.
This is not Oslob. This is Bolhoon. This is Bolhoon, just before Oslob, actually. This is Bolhoon, in Cebu also. Southeast Cebu. You have Argao, you have Bolhoon, you have Dalaguete, you have Bolhoon, Dalaguete, and then Oslob. Okay. Those of you who are from Cebu would know. Okay, we talk about Jesus, the apostles, and the early disciples. Historical, socio-political, historical context. We need to understand that we are still talking about a very Jewish community. That is the situation, the context of Jesus. Worship of one God, Yahweh, by the people of Israel. But this people of Israel was under Roman occupation. There was a Roman governor, but there were also what we would call local kings, like King Herod and company. They are the counterpart or the collaborators of the Romans. So the Roman governor was basically in charge as far as the Roman Empire is concerned. But as far as the people is concerned, then they have the local kings. And the Romans very wisely just allowed the local kings to have their own say, because that is always one way of making sure that you are, you control them. Okay, the ministry is centered on the high priests, the temple personalities or the religious leaders, and wise men. So you would find all kinds of people like Nicodemus, like the high priests, Annas and Caiaphas. All of those religious leaders are basically concerned about ministries. But notice how the ministries during the time of Jesus was centered around the temple. The temple was a very important part of the religiosity of the Jewish people. And those who, of course, run the temple, those who are, what do you call this, caretakers of the temple, they have the power over the people, especially on religious matters. If you combine the religious leaders with the idea of the king, if they are in cahoots with one another, or if they have a good working relationship, then you can pretty much have a kind of a theocratic arrangement. Theocratic in a sense that there is the religious, at the same time the secular. But a very important part of the Jewish experience is the idea of the family worship during the Sabbath. It's what we would call a very domestic church. Because when you talk about the Sabbath, you can actually have your own Sabbath prayer in your own home, in your own family. As a matter of fact, traditionally, that is always what the Jews had done. After working and in preparation for the Sabbath, they all wash up, clean up, and then go back to their homes, and then they start their Sabbath prayer. They start the Sabbath by having a kind of a Sabbath prayer. But so that gives you an idea of what is the, it is not just all centered on the temple, or in other words, not just on the whole idea, the experience with God, or the experience with religion is not just totally, what do you call this, centered around the temple, but also there's an element that has been brought into the families there. And that is why we can say that the religiosity among the Jews is something that's very deep, because it is not just on the part of the temple, but on the part also of the family. Definitely, there are some big celebrations during big feasts, like the Passover or like the Hanukkah and all the other big feasts, the Feast of the Atonement. Those are all big feasts. And of course, those big feasts happen or occur in the temple. And you have to go to those big feasts in order to participate in the celebration itself. So that's basically the socio-political historical context of Jesus.
Father,
Yes.
I just want to ask, where do they usually read the Shema? Is it in the family celebration, or usually when they gather in their temples?
It can be both. But it's the Shema is the prayer that is common for everybody. Everybody should in fact memorize that Shema, because the Shema is basically saying that there's no other God. This is our only God, and we come to worship Him. And they have it also in the Sabbath prayer. It's part of the Sabbath prayer. But Shema is what we would call, for our own, in comparison to our own practice, is probably the Our Father that we can recite anywhere.
It might also be, it might connote as well as the preamble, so to speak, of their Jewish culture and practice, Father.
Yeah, yes, in a way, but you know that for them the Torah or the Mosaic law is the law. So the Shema is found, of course, in the books of the Torah, the 4 books. But the preamble would be, it's like a summary of everything that they believe in. Basically, it's a summary of their belief in one God who takes care of them as a people. That's basically the content of Shema Israel. Okay?
Thank you, Father.
All right. Now, during the time of Jesus, what are the types of ministry or ministers? What is the kind of ministry that Jesus was exercising? Well, we all know already from the New Testament, from the Gospels, that Jesus was a healer, a teacher, but also a revealer of good news. Probably he was most famous for being a healer. Whenever there is a kind of a healing, it's always something that is, well, it's miraculous from the eyes of some people, but it is always something that catches the attention of people. When you speak about Father Suarez, the late Father Suarez, of course, He was, uh, he was. Many people were attracted to his ministry because precisely he was reputed to have a healing power, and that was what Jesus had, healing power. But he was also a teacher, and people flock around him in order to what he says to learn from him. And what he was teaching was something quite different, as often we have often heard from the scriptures. People were amazed at him because he was teaching with authority. So if you're somebody who is a great teacher, normally it's logical that they would have attract so many people. They flock to people who are good teachers. But also, you have to remember that the mission of Jesus was basically to reveal the good news. And the good news is the good news of the Father's love. Okay. And this is what he was trying to do. He was the incarnation of the Father's love for all people. But not only Jesus, but also the disciples were also doing their work. Were they healers? Sometimes they were able to heal, especially after the resurrection of Jesus. They were a bit more they performing some healing also. But they were also teachers, learning from Jesus, of course. But very importantly, they were witnesses to what was happening or what Jesus was doing. This is a very, very important role that they would be playing, of course, especially afterwards. But if you were a disciple and you were together with Jesus, you were going from town to town with Jesus, then you must have had a very big reputation because you're going with someone who is quite famous. So these are different ministries, but we will notice that the ministry is centered around Jesus. Jesus is the number one minister. Jesus heals, Jesus teaches, Jesus is a direct minister. Uh, he does all of these things. But what was his perspective? Why was he doing all of these things? We have discussed in our class on Christology that behind the actions of Jesus, like the miracles and even the teaching, was a basic message that he wanted to convey to the people, to his audience. And that is the message of the kingdom of God, that God reigns. This is basically the theme that preoccupied Jesus, telling people about the kingdom of God. But so Jesus considered himself as the incarnation of the kingdom of God in their midst, now being experienced by the early Christians or by those early disciples, his apostles, but at the same time the disciples, as well as the audience that have listened to him, people who have been attracted to his his preaching. They have become part of this community, and this is a community of the disciples of Jesus. This is something that is very strong because it is this idea that they belong to this community of that Jesus had formed that gave them authority to say what they had to say later on, especially after the resurrection and when they were going from place to place. Paul, for example, having able to preach the gospel in different places. Peter and the other disciples, they were all as members of the community of Jesus's disciples. Okay. But more importantly, the ecclesiological perspective is that they are all of this together as a community. That is the way they look at themselves as a community. True, probably a kind of a separatist sect from Judaism, because now they're talking about a message that Jesus had inaugurated before them, but a kind of message that probably was going already away from Judaism because it was going away from the parochialism of Judaism, in other words, only among the Jews, into something that is much more universal, much more inclusive. And that is the power of the community. Now, how was ministry understood during this time, during the time of Jesus? We have to know that, again, from the words of Jesus himself, he doesn't undertake all of these ministries, doesn't undertake healing, teaching, and revealing of the good news or preaching about the good news on his own. He has been sent by the Father. The Father has sent him in order to reveal to people, not only to the Jews, but to all, about the Father's love. In turn, Jesus was also sending his disciples on mission to give witness to the message of Jesus and to tell them about what this message is all about. So, in a way, the mission the ministry that the apostles received from Jesus, or the disciples that they have received from Jesus, is a mission that comes from Jesus himself. And that is why the authority of this type of both ecclesiology and theology of ministry is so great, precisely because they are connected with the very source of ministry himself, and that is Jesus. So it's very important to know exactly why the apostles have such great authority, because after Jesus, it was the apostles who had authority on what to teach and how to gather together a community in the spirit of Jesus. All right, so this is this is what we have found in the New Testament. I need not elaborate on this because we have talked about this in Christology, and for those who have not taken Christology, you will be talking about this in Christology. All I wanted to do here is simply to tell you about ministers in the experience of Jesus. The number one minister, the minister par excellence, is Jesus. Everybody else participates in that ministry. We even up to now, we are called to share in the mission of Jesus. That mission is not ours and ours alone. It is something that has been handed on to us by Jesus, and of course by the other disciples and the apostles, and of course generations and generations of church communities and church leaders.